So let's talk about list in the context of ACL2. This will help you with your project, which is next project, which manipulates lists. So the first thing you should know, of course, is that nil is the empty list, okay? And if I type NIL, I get back NIL. Now, that's also the same thing as false in ACL2. That's unfortunate, but it is what it is, okay? Another way that I can put an empty list is to put an open parentheses and a close parentheses, and you notice that that actually returns the same value, just nil, okay? Now, I actually don't like putting open and close parentheses, and I'll show you why. Because here is not the way to say the list that contains 1, 2, and 3, okay? Notice that it's an open parentheses and then 1, 2, 3 spaces, no commas, right? That's ACL2 syntax. Now, the reason you want to do that is because that's actually a syntax error. And whenever you have parentheses and then a whole bunch of items, ACL2 interprets that as a function call. So it thinks that this is the function 1 being called with the arguments 2 and 3. That is clearly not correct. So the way to fix that is to put a single quote in front of the expression. So single quote 1, 2, 3 is actually a list that has the elements 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so that's how we write lists, and that single quote is important. Remember, if you want it to be interpreted, right? So if you actually want to well, have it evaluated, and here's an example. If I say plus 2, 3, then that's interpreted. It returns 5. But if I put a quote in front of that, then I'm saying do not interpret it. I want the literal plus 2, 3. That's actually the list that consists of the symbol plus and then the numbers 2 and 3. Okay. So anyway, that's what lists look like in ACL2. That's the way that constant lists are written. Okay. Now there's another thing you can do, and that is you can say list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example, hit return, and that actually returns the list that has the elements 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. List is actually a function, okay, and it's a function that takes a varying number of arguments. So if I type list by itself, there's no elements in it, so that's the empty list. If I type list of 1, then that is the list that contains just the element 1, and then list of 1 and 2 is the list consisting of the elements 1 and 2. Okay, so yeah, that's that much makes sense. Okay, another way to create lists is to use cons. Okay, now cons is a function that takes in 2 arguments. It takes in an element and a list. So for example, cons 1 and then the list 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, notice that second argument is quoted. Okay, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then it's actually the list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So think of it as taking the number 1, the first argument, and putting it in front of the list as the second argument. Okay, if you don't give a list of the second argument, then you just making an error. That's an improper way of calling cons. It's like trying to add Fred and Sally. You can't do that. Those are strings, not numbers. Okay, so some other examples that you can see: cons 1 nil. That is the list that just contains 1. And just so that we have all the syntax here straight, cons 1 with a list 2, 3, 4 is of course 1, 2, 3, 4. And that is the same as if I simply quoted cons 1 with quote 2, 3, 4. Okay? And just to make sure that you're following me, if I say cons 1 and then parentheses 2, 3, 4, I should get a syntax error because parentheses 2, 3, 4 is not a list. That is actually a function call. Call the function 2 with the arguments 3 and 4, which simply doesn't make sense. Okay. All right. There's another function that you need to know, and that is const_p. And so const_p is a function that returns true or false depending on whether the argument, it's just got one argument, is a non-empty list. So const_p of 3 is false or nil because 3 is not a non-empty list. Const_p of the list 1, 2, 3, 4 is going to be true because that is a non-empty list. And const_p, parentheses, const_p of simply the empty list, okay, is nil because that is not a non-empty list, and I can write that as const_p nil as well. Again, that's nil. Notice that const_p nil is a list, and then it returns nil. Now I'm treating it as a boolean. Okay, so const_p is the way that I can check to see whether something is or is not a list. Okay. Now, some other kind of useful lists, or rather useful functions. First. Okay. And first gives me the first element of a list. So, for example, the first of 1, 2, and 3, well, what do you think is going to be? Hazard a guess? 1, right? Yeah, that's the first element of the list. Actually, there's also second. 1, 2, 3. That's 2. And third of the list, 1, 2, 3, of course, is 3. Okay. There is a fourth. And that actually returns nil. And that's because it couldn't find a fourth element. Okay. There's also something called rest. And what rest does is it returns the remainder of the list after you take out the first element. So if I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, when I do rest, I get the list 2, 3, 4, 5. And if I take the rest of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then I will get, well, that's just the rest of 2, 3, 4, 5, which is 3, 4, 5. Okay. If I take the first of the rest of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then that's going to be the first element of 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, it's just the second element, right? Okay. There's kind of a cool function called last. So the last element of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, when I hazard a guess, is just 5, right? Fortunately not. It's actually the list containing 5. Why? I don't know. That's just the way they defined it. So if you really want the last element, you have to say first of last of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is actually the number 5. Okay. There's one more function. I don't think you'll ever use it, but just to let you know. And that function is nth. Okay. And I can say nth one of the list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what that returns is the second element. Okay. It's just like an array lookup in C++ or Java. So it's zero-based indexing, right? So the first element is nth 0 of something. That should be 1, right? And it lets me look up, like the fourth element of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's actually not the fourth, it's the fifth, right? So that's 5. And if I go beyond the edge, right, so then we get nil. And that's just like with rest, when you went too far, that it just returns nil, right? Or when we tried fourth, or there's a fifth and a sixth and so on, of a list that doesn't have that many elements, and that's it just returns nil. Okay. I guess the only other thing I want to show you is what happens with like rest when you apply it to nil. You actually get nil. What happens to rest when you apply it to something that's not a list? You get an error. Okay, so taking the rest of an empty list is not considered an error. It just returns nil. Taking the rest of something that's not a list at all is actually going to be an error. Okay, so those are all the built-in functions that apply to lists. These are the ones that you should know about. And remember, we basically have cons and list to construct lists, right? We have const p to check to see if something is a non-empty list. We have first, second, third, etc. to get elements of a list, or more generally nth to get elements of a list. And then we have rest to get everything but the first element of a list. That always returns a list. And last, which returns the last element but in a list. Okay, and that's all the ACL2 functions you'll ever need to use to process lists.